Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. Here in this episode, we are continuing our journey through the book by Timothy Keller, Generous Justice. Feel free to follow with us. We're coming to the final few chapters of this book. We will be moving on to another book, and we'll let you know what that book is shortly. At the moment, we are reviewing chapter 6, which I dubbed D's chapter. How should we do justice? We shall find out whether that met D's expectations or not, but I'm sure we'll get there soon enough. We're working through some of what of our reflections are of this chapter. If you'd like to follow on with us with the other episodes that we've been doing for the entire project Pages to Progress, you can do so by going on to eastsidesda.org/pages to progress, and you'll be able to find all the episodes there on our YouTube page. So we're going to dive straight into chapter 6. How should we do justice according to Timothy Keller? I was going to say according to Timothy Keller, but actually it's not totally according to Keller. It's more like him serving as a lens according to someone else that he actually works through. What's the name of this guy? John Perkins.
Perkins initially.
Right. And then he eventually goes on through the eyes of someone else towards the end. We're going to work through some of our reflections of what really stuck out at us. I will start with one thing that I will mention on page 110, which I think pretty much surmises the direction of where he's going. And on page 110, Timothy Keller says this: God does not want us to merely give the poor perfunctory help, but to ponder long and hard about how to improve the entire situation. And I think that this was the main quest and goal of Keller throughout this chapter as to what he was trying to unveil bit by bit. Now, I don't know about you two. I'll say this and then I'll be quiet after this. I saw 3 elements of what he tried to propose in this chapter as to how we are to do justice. And those 3 elements that I've identified, according to Keller, is relief, development, and reform. Those are the 3 elements I picked out. Have I missed out anything? Do you guys want to add anything to that?
No, that actually came from Perkins, I think, more than Keller.
Yes, came from Perkins. So Perkins was a theologian, a pastor, if you were, who tried to really hit these 3 points in his ministry and try to expand them. Why don't we start with relief? Why don't we start with the whole idea of what he presents as relief? So just to make it quite clear in terms of what we are defining as relief, hold on, I'm probably lost here. Relief is literally meeting the needs of individuals on a very primary basis. So for instance, we see someone who needs some money or who needs some food, we offer them that, and it does no more than just help them in that immediate scenario. What is the problem with relief is the first question I'll ask, and you guys can go take that question where you want to go in your reflections on this chapter. So let's start with this. Are there any problems with relief?
Well, it's just a short term, right? Okay. It's just that immediate relief or meeting that need, but it doesn't go to actually to remove the cause or the factors that put that person into that situation.
I'm wondering, Dee, do you think that if relief is only short term and does not actually hit the source of the problem, that should we be creating distance from relief?
No, I don't. And as I was, reading this, I mean, I knew this before, and I think this is one of the primary reasons why, on a personal level, that I have not been fully satisfied at what I do. I mean, because, what as on a personal level, and I think, to be honest, and as a church body as well, we have been engaged a lot in relief effort. So we go in, we provide food or something, money, whatever it might be, and then we're done with that. We don't we don't see the everlasting impact, or we don't make that. I don't think we make that everlasting impact. But I think it is essential. It's essential because when someone is hurt, you're not going to just ignore and just walk by. Just like the story of a Samaritan, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Anything to add, John?
No, I mean, I think in a lot of ways it's different levels. I think he actually describes it as levels.
Yes, he does.
Yeah, levels of help was the subtitle for that. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's important, but it's just a start. But it's also a process, like I've mentioned before. And I think, you know, some people are going to be better at some of these levels than other people. And I think near the end of the chapter, that becomes even more evident. But it has to start somewhere, and Relief's as good a place as any to start.
Right. Okay. I think it's quite clear that many of our churches have been involved in this aspect. And I would say we're stuck in Relief. And one of the reasons why I think that is because we don't know how to go beyond it. And I guess, I don't know, I kind of want to move on to the next part, which is development, but I don't know if you guys have any more statements on Relief. Can I move on to development?
Mm-hmm.
No, I'd like to say that I agree with you. I think Relief is, so much of what happens with Relief happens at church around the holidays, starting with Thanksgiving and then going through Christmas, and then it doesn't get done for another year. But again, it's a little bit of a process, and it involves some commitment, and taking that step from Relief to development isn't just a little step. I think it's a huge step in a lot of ways, especially if you're going to do it right.
Okay, so the steps towards development, and this is where things get incredibly comfortable. You know, it was uncomfortable. It was easy to read about someone else's experiences of how they have actually moved into development, but I couldn't help but wonder to myself as I was reading this, so what does this mean for my context? I was initially frustrated because he kept talking about those who are situated within poor communities, or those who have upon their hearts the poor communities. And it's not until later that he addresses the issue. So what if you don't live within a poor community? Which is, I think, the context for East Side in terms of Kirkland and the East Side and the area. I don't think in comparison to much areas in Seattle, we're considered to be a poor community. But in terms of development, I'll read this on page 115. These are some of the things that he was talking about in terms of the complexities of what we need to plug into: education, job creation, training, job search skills, and financial counseling, as well as helping a family into a home ownership. Development, of course, is far more time consuming, complex, and expensive than Relief. It's the difference between signing up for something with a one-off payment and signing up for something with an auto pay. And Relief really pushes us into the needs of the local community. How did you guys respond to his dialogue with development? Did what he says in this chapter resonate with you? Did you feel he went far enough? Do you feel he covered all the bases for you both?
So I think he handled it well. I will say I had the sense that I needed to sell everything and move into some poor neighborhood to actually be able to accomplish what he wanted to do. And that left me a little bit uncomfortable, not a little, a lot uncomfortable. But I think, again, near the end of the chapter, and I hope we have time to discuss that,
Sure.
He was able to balance it. And I think that's kind of a key word, is balance. The other thing is that Keller is basing most of this chapter on Perkins and his experience. And I think it's balanced with one other guy later on in the book. And Perkins has a gift and has been able to do this, relief, development, and social justice, social reform, not justice, social reform. And it sounds like he spent a good chunk of his life doing this. And each of these are different steps. I mean, we talked about development being a step over relief. Well, social reform is another huge step.
Right.
And so I think we need to keep things in context, but also remember that God gives everyone different gifts. And Perkins had a gift for this that I struggle with, honestly. I have a desire, and I feel like it's God sent desire to be involved with, relief, development, and social reform. But I probably only have gifts in areas of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's frustrating when you're gifted with something and you're trying to do something else that someone else has gifts in. I don't think that's God's will necessarily, and it can be real frustrating.
Yeah.
For me, reading this part, I thought that, development, under the development, giving or helping the individual and the family, as a church body, as a corporate body, it was definitely doable. If we were to identify several individuals or several families and the whole entire church coming together to do this, I thought it was a very doable thing. But when it came to, it says in the entire community, I honestly, I thought like, oh my goodness, like that left me feeling overwhelmed and wondering, is that even possible? And it would be someone, if not, I mean, obviously several people's, I think, full-time job to do something like this, I think. But it identified different things that needs to get done, right? Different tools or different, and our church, we have many people with different talents and different skills.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we all pull together, right? And maybe we can't hit every single one of these, but I think that we can definitely be able to do this.
I tried my best to not be overwhelmed by the chapter because I felt the same way as you, John, as well. So I'm supposed to sell everything, and so we move our entire church from Kirkland. Are we supposed to? Are you delegitimizing our presence in our community, in the community in Kirkland? Are there not people in Kirkland who also need help and stuff? And I think the safest way to, I guess, translate and respond to all of this, I think we as a church need to pick one thing, just one. We need to keep our ears to the ground and pick one thing. And one of the first things that I wrote down, which I don't think Keller did a lot expanding on, but this is what I'm going to say in reflection. One of the first things I think that we can do to try and bridge from relief to development is turn up, is find spaces in the community upon which we become part of that community. I'm not talking about spaces where we turn up every now and again with a check, or we drop some soup into a homeless person's bowl once every quarter or once every year. I literally mean to turn up into our community, doing something where we interact with people who are in need on a regular basis every single week.
So
now, go on.
That jumps all the way to page 143 with that mission that he talks about. And it's in italics. It says the same person going to the same people regularly to become their friend for Jesus's sake. And so I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that might be the difference between relief. I mean, that's kind of, hit or miss, day in, day out, versus development is, everything we talked about development being, but also developing a relationship so that you can take that next step. And Keller starts talking about evangelism at some point.
He does.
In this context as well.
So here's the thing, John and Dee, that really challenged me when I was thinking about this. Because it's quite clear that we, the church, I will openly say, and I include myself in this paradigm, we have a problem where we simply do not foster environments where we try to entertain at least development and social reform in some fashion or form. So I thought to myself, what is the actual problem? And I actually don't think that we have a justice problem. I think we have a missional problem. I think we as a church are just not used to turning up into different spaces, even on a missional level. I can't speak for you guys, but the average Adventist, I wonder to myself, how many non-Adventist, non-Christians, close friends do we have that we meet on a regular basis with in our actual community that we have not met through our relationships in church? And I know for me, I can say not many, and I'm still trying to push myself out there. I know COVID has changed a lot of things for people and stuff like that, but the more that we plug into our community, the actual people who live on this territory, the more God will open our eyes to the actual needs that need to take place. Because I suspect that the church will make every effort to push for development and reform. However, and this is where I'm very tentative in this, and I said this before, quoting Keller, it's very expensive, it's very time consuming, and it takes a lot for someone to really concentrate everything and all their hearts on focusing on development, because it ultimately means that we may have to sacrifice, I don't know, the building of our church, for instance, obtaining a building and moving forward in that respect. I'm just throwing something out there as something that we would have to try and plug into the local community. So that was something that really challenged me in that respect. And I definitely think we need to be more intentional with that in order to try and find the needs in our community. I'll be honest and say, I don't know the needs of our community.
Well, and that's an issue. And I think that's an issue with almost every Adventist church out there, is we get comfortable in our community and we get comfortable. I mean, a lot of Adventists are in healthcare. A lot of them work at Adventist healthcare institutes. Our kids go to Adventist schools. They teach in the schools. And our community ends up being more or less an Adventist community, which it's to the exclusion of anyone outside that community, whether they have needs or not. And unless you actually step out of that community, you won't know. And even then, initially, unless you get a deeper relationship, it's going to be very superficial.
Right.
And, but I would say that what you're talking about is possible. And I know it's overwhelming, but it's got to start somewhere. And then ultimately, it has to be God-led.
Yeah.
And if it is God-led, other people that are feeling the same thing will be led. And, the possibilities are endless when God's in charge and God's leading.
Right. Let's slightly move on. I wanted, before we get deeper into social reform, well, this is part of social reform, really. I was really interested in the chapter on relocation and redistribution and racial reconciliation. Those were some of the powerful segments that really kind of struck out to me, particularly with redistribution in terms of resources and people who are in charge and people who are running these things. Sometimes we are tempted to go in as a church, try and minister to a particular scenario, and then head back home afterwards, rather than actually utilizing the actual current resources that are in the community. And some missionary, it turns into like a traditional missionary trip, where we go and do what we need to do, and then we leave. And none of the people in the community are helpful because they haven't been trained to actually uphold some of the systems that will guide people out of poverty or whatever the problem is. The second thing that came out for me was on racial reconciliation. And I'll mention this, and I'll be quiet after this because I want to know what you guys think. I thought it was remarkable. I've never actually seen this before. What did you guys think of the Pentecost, the Holy Spirit coming down at Pentecost and allowing individuals to understand each other in their various languages, being a direct response as a reverse to the curse of what happened at the Tower of Babel in Genesis? Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, that was powerful. I thought that was really, really powerful.
Yeah. It was, I almost had initial problems with the idea of what God was trying to do at Babel.
Me too. Yeah.
And I cannot tell you, even as a minister, that I have the answer to that totally. What I can say is that what happened at Pentecost was something profound upon which God wants us to replicate in our community. And it's very easy. Now, here we're talking about racial reconciliation, where we might have organizations which are totally white or totally skewed to one particular race or culture. But I'm going to push the boat out a bit closer to home. Sometimes our efforts in the community are too Adventist and too skewed into one particular perspective that we fail to see the non-Adventist perspective. I don't know if I'm stepping on stones I shouldn't have, but do you guys get what I mean? What do you think?
I mean, I think you see the world through the lens you kind of grew up with. Mm-hmm. And if you grew up as an Adventist, you can't help but see the world but through an Adventist lens. I don't think it's all bad, but I think it's like you said, you know, a typical missionary is, you know, you come into wherever you're coming into, you clothe all the natives, and then you sit them down and teach them about Jesus, and you baptize them, and then you leave, and it doesn't leave much of an infrastructure, and it generally doesn't accomplish, I don't know if it accomplishes exactly everything you want. I mean, obviously it's worked to some degree, and it's continued to a greater degree. Mm-hmm. But I agree. I mean, I think we're in a first world country, and like you said, I mean, it's not like there aren't needy people in our immediate community, but I think it may be that our immediate community is mostly people with different needs that might need a different missionary approach.
Right.
And that needs to be more out of the box thinking.
Okay.
A younger generation, a more technologically oriented generation might be able to reach that generation, that immediate community better than, you know, the older generation in a lot of ways.
You wanted to say something, Dee?
No, I was going to go back to the comment you made about the Pentecost and everyone coming, speaking the same language. You know, that reading that part, it made me stop and kind of think about, kind of draw back, because I thought he was stretching the whole understanding of it or interpretation of that, what had happened, a little too much. But one thing I think it made me wonder if the whole entire world was in one language as God had intended in the first place. I mean, the language got all separated at the Tower of Babel, right? Mm-hmm. But if the language did remain the same throughout the entire world, would there not be still this divisions and oppressions and all of that? And I think my conclusion is that still, I think there would have been divisions among people. There would have been oppressions, because it's not a language issue. Because if you look at every country, you know, every country fought within itself for land, right? For people. So it's not so much of the language issue, but like it says, you know, it is about the human pride and the need for power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the take-home message for me, at least for the Tower of Babel. I mean, the world in its perfect state or semi-perfect state after the fall, you know, everyone, and there were all nationalities, spoke the same language and presumably got along, but the world got worse and worse to the point where Jesus just came down. I mean, God came down and said, I wished I wouldn't have even created man. I'm going to wipe the slate clean. He does that with Noah and the flood. And then, you know, immediately sin takes hold again. And I think the Tower of Babel is kind of the epitome of that, you know, shortly after the flood. And that quote there right in the middle of the page on 121, it says, human pride and lust for power leads to racial and national divisions, strife, and hatred.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could essentially say we all speak the same language now,
Mm-hmm.
but the problem isn't speaking the language or not speaking the language. It's that human pride and lust for power. And you can talk about the Pentecost, the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit coming down, everyone's, speaking different languages. And certainly the apostolic church that came out of that had a unity that hasn't been seen since, because sooner or later, pride and lust for power led to racial and national division, strife, and even hatred within the church.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still dealing with that.
So the last section, social reform. I'm going to read a quote on page 126, and then I'm going to ask a question based upon the rest of the conclusion of the chapter. So it says this on page 126, right at the top: social reform moves beyond the relief of immediate needs and dependency and seeks to change the conditions and social structures that aggravate or cause that dependency. So in other words, at the very height of social reform, it involves changing policy. It involves having a voice that changes the way that we do things to try and eradicate certain barriers that prevent people within the poverty structure, etc., etc. Here's my question that I wrestled with all the way to the end of the chapter. I don't know if you wrestled with the same question, but here's my question. What's the role of the church? That's my question. And I asked that question within the context of what Keller talks about on page 132, where he calls churches in poor neighborhoods can serve as healers in communities. I don't actually believe that it's just for poor churches in poor neighborhoods. I just think churches, full stop, should be healers in communities. I struggled with what Keller was trying to propose, in the notion that, correct me if I'm wrong, I got the impression Keller was saying our job is not really in social reform as a corporate body. Our job is to empower individuals to step forward individually and provide spaces of social reform. That's how I read the end of the chapter. What did you guys think?
I thought there was 2 levels of that. I mean, that was that, like you just said, right? Ultimately, yes, we need to educate or prepare individual people. But at the same time, I thought he had church as your own church body, getting into being involved in the development and relief and all of that. And then as what did he call that? Organic church? I don't exactly remember the exact word he used, but
something like that.
Yeah, organic church meaning like the Seventh Day, like if we're talking about our church, Seventh Day Adventist, like general conference level or whatever, that upper level, right? Instead of at our level as individual churches. So I don't think he was just talking about let's just prepare each individual person only, but he had separated out the 2 levels of it, the 2 levels of the church role.
Okay, go on, John.
So I think this kind of maybe stressed you out a bit, but actually gave me some relief, because I think Keller basically, he basically said that the church's role is evangelism.
Yes.
And not social justice at all, which initially to me was a slap in the face, because I mean,
do you think he totally says that?
Huh?
Yeah,
he totally says that?
I don't think so.
Do you think he totally says that the church's role is evangelism, not social justice?
He initially says that, in my mind, because I was a little taken aback by it, and honestly a little offended by it. But then I think he backed up a little bit, and then the quote that I kind of took away from that is on page 144, where he says, but that doesn't mean that the church as an institution is itself to do everything it equips its members to do. It does have a role in social justice, but I think its greater role is to utilize the resources within the church, in that different people have different gifts. And you're going to have people within the church that will naturally be social reformers and be able to fight through the politics and the policies that it's going to take to change the immediate community and a greater community. And then you're going to have some people that are better at development, that are going to see it as a mission to take on a family or two or three, or take on a whole building where you put a whole bunch of families in and create a whole infrastructure to getting them better and out into the community as healthy, viable families. And then there's always going to be some people that just do the very basics. You know, every once in a while, they'll throw a little money at a little project, and that's all they do. And I think there's a balance. I think there's a role for the church. I think Keller was getting away from the fact that it's the church's responsibility to do social reform. I think he was very clear that it was the church's responsibility to nurture and to lead and guide its members to be an extension of itself. At least that's how I read it.
Dee, how did you read Keller's dialogue between social justice and evangelism?
I did not. That's not how I read it. It's actually quite the opposite. On page 142, I mean, basically the note that I wrote is basically Keller is telling us to walk the talk. I mean, you can evangelize till you're blue in the face, but if you're not living it, as in being out there, actually demonstrating, actually practicing social justice, basically doing what you're preaching, then your words have no value to the people, the listeners. And so, you know, here on page 142, it says toward the bottom, there is no better way for Christians to lay a foundation for evangelism than by doing justice.
Sorry, Dee,
So,
I'm gonna read just slightly before that, because I actually highlighted just slightly. Deeds of mercy and justice should be done out of love, not simply as a means to the end of evangelism. And then your quote, and yet there is no better way for Christians to lay a foundation for evangelism than by doing justice.
Yeah, but I'm going to go a sentence ahead of that, because it says, but if neighbors see church members loving their city through astonishing sacrificial deeds of compassion, they will be much more open to the church's message. But that's the members going out to the community, which ultimately positively impacts the community. And they're like, hey, what are you about? And then that's what brings the new members, or brings the community into the church to potentially become new members.
And I don't think that we're disagreeing here.
No.
I think here's where this hit me hard, because I found myself guilty on page 142, because I have done mercy and justice as a means to the end of evangelism before, many times.
Oh, I see.
And I know I am guilty as charged. I've thought to myself, let me do this so that they can give their life to Jesus Christ and accept them as Lord and Savior of their lives. That is not what the Samaritan did.
Right.
And here is what is uncomfortable with the message of generous justice. It is the idea of being so passionate about helping my neighbor that I'm ready to receive nothing in return. That, I think Keller argues uncomfortably, that is evangelism.
Do you think he's uncomfortable in saying that? I didn't get that sense.
It's uncomfortable for me to try and help you, Dee, to help you, Dee, and say nothing about Jesus Christ, or not you.
Oh, okay. I see.
Okay.
Yes, I see.
But it is the silent, powerful witness of doing deeds of mercy and justice that sometimes has more power than the very words that we actually preach from our pulpits. And I think what Keller is saying is evangelism is not social justice and evangelism, it's social justice and evangelism.
Right.
Yeah, and he clarifies that, and he definitely says there's a balance. But then I guess the question is the mission for the church the same as the mission for the church members?
And that's what I struggled with. Go on, Dee.
I mean, should it not be? I mean, as a members of that organization, should not our mission be the same? Because as the organization, because if it's not, why are we joining that organization? If our mission and values are not the same, why are we there for?
It's not the mission and values that I think John's question is pointed to.
Then,
it's actions.
Right.
the actions, you mean the actions. So your question is, should the members of the church's actions should be the same as the actions of the church?
Right, because maybe the church's role is to empower people and resource them and give them the tools and abilities to be able to open a day center or a homework club, which are organized by one or two individuals who put their minds together. But it's not necessarily a church thing. It's a members who are inspired by the values of the church thing.
I see.
Into their community to inspire other people to take an interest in what's causing you to do these things. And that's when you say, well, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus. And they're like, well, where do you go to church? Well, I go to this church, and this is where we learn to do that better.
So here's the challenge that I faced walking away from this chapter, is because I'm not averse to the idea that the church's role is also to do grandiose systems that challenge a community to bridge from relief to development to social reform. Like, for instance, open up a massive center, a center of influence. Well, it has a homework club, and it's a place for refugees to be able to get jobs and sort out their own resumes, and all kinds of different stuff to get people out of the poverty line, and seminars and all these kinds of things. But I don't think we spend enough time educating, resourcing, and enabling people to believe that they can do it and show them how to do it as an individual.
Right.
Because here's the danger that I feel it's cyclical. I won't do it because my church isn't doing it. And my church won't do it because I'm not doing it.
Right.
The cycle has to be broken somewhere.
I don't want to throw a monkey wrench into the whole thing, but something that's always bugged me is the feeling that the church has to do all of this stuff on its own, when literally, across the street from the church,
right,
or a street or two from the church, are organizations that have been doing this from a secular perspective for years, if not decades, and have, unfortunately, a stronger influence on the community than the church does. Why is the church trying to do what these organizations are doing when we can team up with the organizations and empower them and help them to do a better job? And then, ironically enough, make contacts with people that aren't Adventists,
right,
and may have never met Adventists, or unfortunately met Adventists, in a bad sort of way. I think there's some power to that, and it doesn't put, social reform or development, the next step down, development, on the church. The church can just empower its members, and the members can empower some of these organizations, and it might build a community, that's more like Acts 2, that apostolic church that, had all these resources that it used.
And so much diversity, not to mention the cultures and the language, but diversity in terms of how they think. And I'm totally with you. I think one thing that holds us back as an Adventist church is part of our theology, a dangerous part of our theology that seems to try and promote an exclusivity to how we do mission and how we do evangelism. God has already been working overtime on humanity. We are late to the game. And we turn up and we take a seat and we're on page 9. And God is inviting us. He's offered us the grace to not go back and start again on page 1. Join the party. Mission is happening, and it's happening all around us. This chapter really challenged me, as a leader of a church, as a pastor of Eastside and stuff, to start thinking about ways that we can plug our ears to the community on a regular basis, which doesn't need to have the Adventist sticker of approval. It just needs to be doing God's mission by literally providing relief, development, and reform. And secondly, God is challenging me on an individual level, because we all have an individual responsibility to do our part in providing relief, development, and reform in different aspects of our lives, even if it's in a small way. That's my prayer for us, I think. Any final thoughts as we wrap up, guys?
I think for me, there were 3 takeaways, and one is that, definitely doing justice is Christian identity. It's our identity as an individual and even as a church, I believe. And second, and then third is
sorry, Dee, could you repeat number 2, please?
I said second thing is what you have just mentioned. Well, not exactly what you mentioned, but actually identifying the focus or the area that you want to be able to do relief, development, and social change. And then third thing is, third note that I have, third thing is actually, you mentioned this too, is pulling resources together, not just to try to do this on our own. Like you said, people have already been doing this for years, right? Reach out to people. It doesn't matter whether they're Seventh Adventist or non-Christian or Christian. Just reach out and get involved. Yeah.
John?
Yeah, so the title of the chapter is How Should We Do Justice? And I think the key is that word do, D0. Not D0, D-O.
It's all right. John's just come from work, so he's still trying to change.
And as you do it, you're going to have some successes and you're going to have some failures. And you certainly need to keep your relationship with God and be praying about what you're doing. And often what you're doing might be just planting a seed or two that someone later will follow up and water and become something that you never see. But the key is to do it. And I truly believe the Spirit will lead you. And I truly believe that if you ignore the calling of the Spirit, you aren't going to hear it as well the next time and the next time. And eventually your own interests will take over and you aren't doing justice. You're doing your own thing.
Right. You said something, John, that... Sorry, go on.
As you do it, that'll strengthen. And like Dee was saying, you will meet people, you will meet organizations, you will find your role within these and within your own church and your church community that'll continue to grow.
Yeah. You said something that really hit me hard, and Keller kind of hinted at it. Prepare to fail if you're going to learn how to do justice. And let me clarify what I mean by that, is that many a times we think we know what the community needs, or based upon our makeup and our resources and what we feel that we have to offer, we feel that's what we need to do. And it may be the case. We may be right about it, but we may turn up and realize that actually God is pointing us to completely different needs that we are very well and capable to do. And we just need to be very clear to recognize that actually we may even find how to do justice by failing. But we're going to do justice if we don't even attempt to try and do it with the cost of at least failing. And like any startup knows, you fail 100 times before you make $1 million. But it was a really challenging chapter. It was a really good chapter. It really made me think. I don't know if that was the same for both. I get the impression it was the same for both of you. Keller is really forcing us to think about things biblically and think about things in a way that if Jesus was here in the flesh, in the here and now, how would he be doing things different? Because it's undeniable. You speak to any Christian, we will always have complaints about the way that we do things as a church and as a body. So the question is, if we know that, we need to start to put in some effective changes, and it starts with us individually and moves to us corporately. It's been a really good discussion. We've gone way over time, but I guess that's because it's been such a heavy and thick chapter for us to get through. I was certainly blessed to have this conversation with both of you guys. And we're glad that you listeners have joined us on the journey for Pages to Progress. And once again, if you can follow up on our other episodes by going to Pages to Progress on our website, eastsidesta.org/pages to progress, you can see all our episodes. Next week, we get to our penultimate chapter. The penultimate chapter entitled Doing Justice in the Public Square. We've got one more chapter after that, I believe. Am I correct, guys? Yes.
Yep.
One more chapter after this, and then we'll be moving on to another book. But this is us saying good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're listening to us, whatever time you're listening to us. Thanks for being with us on the journey. And until next week, may God bless you. Take care, guys.